Funding for Dos Bueno is provided by viewers like you. I have a Patreon linked in the description if you like what I do here. Howdy and welcome back to a Morrowind Retrospective. This is part of a series of videos covering this game, and while it is not required that you watch the rest of the series, it will provide additional context and I would really appreciate it. This video will contain heavier spoilers for Morrowind than the other parts we have done so far, so just be wary of that. God, I hate the Dunmer so much. They are miserable, misanthropic, racist, slave-driving, demon-worshipping theocrats with a repressive society, insane laws, legalized murder for the rich, and they act as a grab bag of a lot of the worst traits that a society could conceivably have and still function. They are miserable, horrid bastards, and they would be the absolute worst people to go to a Spirit Halloween with. They also might just be some of the best presented elves in all of fantasy fiction. A lot of people have a massive love for the Dunmer and Dunmeri culture, not out of any actual urge to live in it or to live around them, but simply because Morrowind does an incredible, impossible thing. It makes you sympathize with a people that most other games categorize as irredeemably evil, without really changing any of the evil that they perform in a meaningful way. The Dunmer are just drow, ye old D&D dark elves, complete with a theocratic demon-worshipping state religion, spider-theming, legalized murder, constant Byzantine-grade power struggles, chattel slavery, and an inhospitable homeland full of mushrooms. They are just drow. They are only really missing the matriarchal aspects of the drow, which makes sense. Bethesda has always been pretty progressive in their games, and gender equality has always been a big part of that. That matriarchal aspect does get a nod with known man-hater and queer icon Mistress Drotha, who rules a settlement filled entirely with women for what I am sure are entirely heterosexual reasons. You can really feel the influence of AD&D's drow in a lot of aspects of the Dunmer, and the fact that Bethesda got so many people to sympathize with the fucking Dark Elves and want to live in Morrowind in their homeland says more about how incredibly fucking good Bethesda is at making a realized, well-rounded culture than it says about the Dunmer. We talked at length about the world space of Morrowind in a previous part, and how Morrowind is a weirdly feasible place with an excellent commitment to making sure that there is an answer for the majority of dumbfuck questions the player has about the world. The people are perhaps just a hair less developed than the world. My personal bugbear is that we find a lot of storerooms and raw ingredients, but fucked all for cooked and finished dishes or kitchens. Where are my kitchens, Todd? Do they scramble the kwama eggs or boil them? Do they cook them at all? Because you keep putting them in bowls like they eat them whole and raw. We do get a half dozen varieties of alcohol native to the region, though, in addition to imported alcohol from the Imperial heartland. Therefore, we have to assume that the average diet of a Bethesda employee working on Morrowind consisted entirely of raw eggs and hard liquor, and honestly, considering what I've read in developer interviews, that might not be that far from the truth. Now, what they lack in kitchens, the Dunmer make up for in the depth of their culture and practices. Many quests, by a rough gut guesstimate, around 70% of the quests in the game, with a huge concentration in the main quest and temple, feature the player being forced up against some aspect of Dunmeri culture and having to adapt to it or bypass it in some way. Maybe you need information, but a woman of dubious moral standing will only give it to you if you go grave robbing and defile the still active and maintained ancestral tomb of a very much living family, or you need to participate in the slave trade to get someone to give you a vote of confidence. As I said, the main quest has a particular focus on the Dunmeri people, and we will get into a lot of the more interesting bits of that when we talk about the main quest in a later part. Morrowind is full of vignettes, though, not just being interested in showing you the high drama and big adventure of, the main quest. A lot of quests pertain to minor feuds or small-scale, very human stories, like a woman furious at the local guard for not defending her livestock, or a man seeking the confidence to talk to women, or a woman searching for the most cynical form of love I have ever seen this side of Fable, or just simply a person wanting a pretty thing and wanting you to bring her one. Every quest isn't high drama or the end of days. Most quests are minor, pedantic, human problems that build up Morrowind and its culture and its people more than any of the many, many, many lore books lining its shelves. These minor quests, where you just help the people of Morrowind with their day-to-day issues, immerse you in the culture of Morrowind and Vardenfell in a way that later Bethesda games honestly completely fail at. Even faction questlines are incredibly low-key, with most focusing on either performing the day-to-day tasks of the organization, elaborating on their place in the world and how they fit within it, like collecting guild dues for the Mages Guild or dealing with people's everyday problems and inconveniences in parts of the Fighters Guild. The ones that don't focus on just building up the faction until it becomes a mundane part of everyday life tend to focus on taking down corruption, rot, and hardliners within the faction. You get a palpable feeling for how every one of these organizations function, and with one glaring exception, thank you Todd Howard, they all do a fantastic job of getting across why these factions are factions and what they do. The only game I can think of that does this good of a job setting up and justifying its factions and factional conflicts is the Stalker series, with its very clear and understandable ideological conflict between the different factions. I generally side with freedom in Stalker, if you're curious. Okay, that is enough introduction. Let's get into some specifics about the Dunmer, their culture, and what major influences I can identify. The Dunmer are technically not native to Morrowind, instead being the descendants of a high elf population that fell in with elf Joseph Smith, an elven priest named Veloth, and moved to Elf Utah. The prophet Veloth is a fascinating character. We know fairly little about him and his motivations. The early Dunmer, or Chimer as they were known at the time, abandoned the worship of the Adric gods, the Imperial and Elven Orthodox good guy gods, that allegedly gave up part of themselves to build the world. They instead began worshipping the Daedric gods, who are much more active in mortal affairs, much easier to speak to and commune with, and tend to give results and answers to prayer faster than the Aedra. Not necessarily good answers, but answers. The Daedra are broadly malevolent, and the three that the Dunmer chose to worship, Mephala, Boethia, and Azura, are particularly malevolent and manipulative, with a callous disregard for the lives of their worshippers and all gods of fairly unpleasant things. In the modern day of the setting, their worship has been replaced with the worship of the Tribunal, a trio of mortal gods who seized power from the severed, still beating heart of Lorkhan, the sometimes dead creator god of the setting. The Tribunal are honestly possibly more malevolent and manipulative than their Daedric predecessors, but further discussion of details on the specifics of the Tribunal gods will have to wait for when we talk about the main quest. For now, just know that Dunmer society is built on top of an incredibly strict and militant religious orthodoxy that venerates evil, actively malevolent deities that bring out the absolute worst in their worshippers at the best of times, and yet life goes on. They might worship evil gods, but the average person isn't a hardliner, and they still need to grow food and keep society running. Most people in Morrowind are decent to each other, and some of them are even decent to foreigners. Though the immense xenophobia of Morrowind is probably its most immediate and recognizable cultural trait, along with being a theocracy. The Dunmer hate foreigners with a passion, having a deep-seated sense of superiority that honestly probably would creep in if you knew that your god was like a guy you could go talk to, but their god never talked to them. They have a thriving slave trade as well, the last remaining holdout of the institution in Tamriel after the majority of the continent has banned the practice for being inefficient and barbaric. If anything, a major complaint I have with the game is that the NPCs aren't racist enough. Playing as a Khajiit or an Argonian, two races most frequently enslaved in Morrowind, barely changes anything, and you can still very easily join any of the Dunmeri institutions, such as the temple or great houses, that likely would turn you away. I would have liked it if there maybe was an extra quest or two to prove your worth or something to these fundamentalist factions, but according to dev interviews, playable Argonians and Khajiit were only decided on fairly late in development, so there likely just wasn't time to implement anything more substantial for them. Moving on in a graceless segue, the Dunmer have fascinating architecture. There are 4 main building types on the island, the 3 native styles and the architectural stylings of the occupying Septim Empire. Hlaalu architecture consists of very rectangular adobe buildings with flat roofs and rounded corners, with a yellowish-brown color scheme. Their capital, Balmora is laid out in a way fairly similar to a more modern-style city, with a planned urban grid and a lot of right-angle streets. It also has a well-defined and separated commercial district and sits on a river that is probably supposed to be navigable. Redoran architecture, meanwhile, is much more round, with a very animalistic and natural shape that tends to evoke slugs, snails, horned animals, and in one case it's just a literal giant crab corpse. Most of it still seems to be made of that same adobe material, though with a slightly different color. The Redoran capital, Aldruin, is much less square, with rounded streets and round buildings facing round squares, round plazas, which brings to mind a war camp full of tents and yurts, almost like they built their city where their armies camped. The Telvanni, rounding out the three native styles, live in giant magically shaped and grown mushrooms. Their settlements, all of them, are chaotic nightmare zones that suck to navigate with round, twisting vertical layouts. Each Telvanni settlement is built around a giant central wizard tower, a massive and twisting thing that dominates the skyline in the settlement. Telvanni wizard towers, infamously, do not have stairs because levitation magic exists, and if you can't cast magic well enough to levitate, they do not want to speak to you. The final style is that of the Imperial occupiers, and it is very heavily based on Tudor wood and plaster houses. You do see a lot of Imperial fortifications in the game as well, which are mostly generic castles with some nice banners. Imperial architecture is generic late medieval fantasy schlock, but it being fairly normal and generic just brings out how unique and fun the Dunmer architecture really is. The first two towns you visit are in the Imperial style, Seydanine and Pelagiad, before you get dumped into Balmora, a sprawling city with exotic buildings and people and a really nice layout. Each of these styles of architecture does a fantastic job of communicating the identities of these factions and groups, and I love it. Hlaalu buildings are comparatively utilitarian and built to maximize internal space, and their city, Balmora, is clearly planned and laid out efficiently to extract as much of your money as possible. I love how the merchants in Balmora are mostly crammed right next to the front gate in a big central square, the first thing you see when you enter the city. This matches Hlaalu's nature as a forward-thinking merchant clan that wants absolutely all of your money. Redoran buildings are rounded and hunched, feeling much more aggressive and warlike, and that tent city style layout that Aldruin has adds to that warlike feeling. In Aldruin, the merchants are all further back, with the guilds and guard towers greeting you to the city instead. The Redoran are fiercely traditional and warlike, so this fits perfectly. Telvanni settlements are actively hostile to you, a pain to navigate, and their buildings are bizarre and not playing by the same rules that normal people normally play by. They rarely have merchants, and God help you if you are trying to find one. This fits their magical power and their burning hatred of outsiders very well. Imperial architecture is the most subtle, with the main thing it communicates being that the Empire and its legions fundamentally have no interest in integrating with the native population and would much rather impose their own culture and laws on a land that is not built for them, does not want them, and is not ready for them. Moving on, Dunmer government is fascinating. They are, on paper, ruled in a hellish autocracy run by their living gods, with the tribunal acting as a triumvirate of dictators and making edicts on the behalf of the people of Morrowind, which are then distributed and enforced by the central temple apparatus. In recent times, though, the tribunal has become less and less active in the day-to-day governance of Morrowind, so the practical power is in the hands of the great houses of Morrowind and the tribunal temple, with the temple acting somewhat as a central authority, banning certain beliefs and practices for being heretical, and generally acting to cow the great houses and force them into functioning as a society. The various great houses are a bizarre mixture of a feudal noble family, the local government, corporation, and a political party, taking in retainers and goons who can rise through the ranks and become part of the faction, even rising to lead it despite not necessarily being members of the actual Hlaalu, Redoran, and Telvanni families. I am unsure if they actually are families or simply organizations that grew out of a family, as some people do have Hlaalu, Telvanni, or Redoran as surnames, but this could be a name adopted out of loyalty to the group more than a family name from birth, and rank within the house doesn't seem to have much to do with whether you're born into it, and more to do with how much you have benefited them and how loyal you are to their ideals. They seem to be very independent from the central state authority of Morrowind, making their own decisions, enforcing their own laws and regulations, and having their own relationships with each other, foreign governments, and the various non-governmental organizations that are active within Morrowind. They're also constantly jockeying for power with each other, competing with each other for the favor of the Temple, the Empire, and anyone else who might give them the slightest advantage. Now, all of this infighting would threaten a civil war were it not for another core pillar of Dunmer society: legalized hitmen! The Morag Tong is an organization that was created as an alternative to large-scale war. They act as an organization that will, with full legality and the backing of both the state and temple, kill anyone you pay them to kill. This allows noblemen to send assassins after each other and avoid killing 5,000 peasants every time they get mad at each other. Bodyguards are part of doing business in Morrowind because anyone you piss off can and will hire a legal hitman to take you out, and if you fail to fight off these legal hitmen, you clearly deserved it and there is no legal recourse for your family other than sending more hitmen. In addition, the Morag Tong are demon worshippers, worshipping the Daedric Prince Mephala, who, as previously noted, is incredibly malevolent. They are an objectively horrid and morally repugnant organization, but they serve an important purpose in Morrowind society, which is allowing this anarcho-capitalist power struggle corporate nightmare zone government to keep going without collapsing into constant blood feuds and endless hell war. Not every house even seems like they would keep a significant military around anymore, with Redoran, Dress, and Endoral being the only ones likely to keep standing forces on retainer, with the latter two barely appearing in the game. Redoran would likely maintain an army of sorts out of martial tradition and a healthy sense of paranoia. Dress would need to keep soldiers on retainer to raid for slaves and defend themselves against retaliatory raids from the Argonians who they are raiding for slaves. And Endoral provides the majority of the mer power of the Tribunal Temple, with nearly all members of the militant Ordinator organization of the Temple coming from House Endoral. Telvanni would have no need for real armies because they could just have their noblemen fly up in the air and nuke people with their brains while summoning demons, and Hlaalu would just hire mercenaries or cry really loudly until the Empire notices. The Dunmer worship gods who encourage them to compete with each other for power at all times, and the Morag Tong are a safety valve built into the system that prevents that particular religious mandate from destroying all of their society. In addition to their native local governmental systems, Morrowind also has at least one duke and a king. Morrowind doesn't seem to have any actual tradition of monarchy, having spent its entire independent life led by various religious figures, with most of them being straight up immortal. The king and duke were forced on Morrowind by the Septim occupiers and serve a dual role as chief enforcers of Imperial law and the face of Imperial power in Morrowind. They do not have nearly the amount of power you would expect from royalty, and most of the native Dunmer have nothing good to say about them or their positions. They handle paperwork, construction permits, and other administrative bullshit that the Empire insists on enforcing. This is very Roman, with the king and dukes being effectively Roman governors of frontier regions, theoretically the final and highest authority in the land, but in practice needing to delegate a significant amount to local pre-existing power structures, while slowly consolidating authority. The current king, Hlaalu Helseth, Pussy Destroyer, is in this consolidation phase, and his story in Tribunal is about his feuds with various other forces and his urge to consolidate power in the monarchy, which has historically never been a good thing. The temple is the final leg on the rotting and uncomfortable stool that is Morrowind's government. The temple is conservative, restrictive, hypocritical, and myopic, but it does provide healing, food, and shelter for the poor and destitute in a way that you don't really see in the rest of Tamriel. Unlike Cyrodiil or Skyrim, Morrowind doesn't seem to have a significant homeless population, as one of the stated purposes of the temple is to help out the least fortunate, and to their credit, they genuinely do seem to do this. However, this is where good things end. as the temple is otherwise a religious nightmare zone. They have branded followers of the old pre-tribunal Daedra-worshipping religion heretics, and have branded anyone who believes in the Nerevarine, basically the Dunmer Messiah, as a heretic. And despite having Daedra worship and interaction as parts of their orthodoxy, are quick to crack down on worshippers of the wrong Daedra, or people who are interacting with said Daedra in the wrong fashion. They also heavily condemn the study of necromancy to the point of having lobbied to make it straight up illegal to practice, despite Dunmer religion making heavy use of necromantic rituals to create guardians for tombs, to call on the spirits of ancestors for advice, and to feed souls into the spooky ghost wall that keeps Dagothur from getting out of Red Mountain and leveling the local Menards. They are hypocritical and hidebound, and generally make themselves as unlikable and unbearable as possible in the majority of interactions that the player has with them. They also probably have the best single questline in the game, and their beliefs and practices are so well explained by this questline that it almost makes them feel real in a way that the overwhelming majority of fantasy religions don't. We'll have a whole video on the Tribunal Temple later. Another interesting facet of governance in Morrowind is the role of the occupying Septim Empire. Due to Oblivion fucking it all up, there's a general belief in parts of the TES community that the Empire is intended to be the hero of the setting. This is deeply untrue, and the Septim Empire is broadly unsympathetic in every single TES game. Arena is a weird case, but starting from Daggerfall, the Empire is broadly underhanded, expansionistic, exploitative, corrupt to the core, and deeply dysfunctional. In Morrowind, they seem to be deep in the slash and burn stage of colonialism. All the soldiers and officials assigned to Morrowind are broadly incompetent and corrupt. We constantly see soldiers plotting, smuggling, being belligerent, killing locals for no reason, taking bribes, and generally Imperial rule is not really portrayed as being particularly good for Morrowind. Slavery is illegal throughout the Empire, but Morrowind is an exception, and Imperial merchants profiteer off of trading goods from slave-run plantations and mines. The Empire can claim moral superiority and decry the practice of slavery all they want, but most of their supply of ebony and glass, rare minerals that they need for both their war efforts and high-end luxury goods, comes from a province that heavily uses slavery on an industrial scale. The Septim Empire's continued tolerance of slavery within Morrowind is hypocritical, and their general policy of wealth extraction and ignoring the native culture and religion and treating it as backward superstition, and their general callousness and corruption, all combine to paint an incredibly negative portrait of Septim rule. We can get further into the Empire's exact role within Morrowind and their plans for the province when we talk about the main quest in a future episode, but suffice to say they're not particularly sympathetic. Morrowind's governmental system is broadly a mess, but it is incredibly unique for fantasy. Most fantasy is weirdly pro-monarchy and politically doesn't stray far away from France in the 1200s. We see a lot of very basic kingdoms in fantasy, so seeing such a different and politically varied system in Morrowind is enthralling and goes a long way towards making the world feel more real. Politics are complicated, and monarchy is by no means the standard or default method of government. My house is getting fucking strafed by planes right now. I hope that they go away. Morrowind has the most feasible and well-explained political system I have seen in a fantasy RPG. The system is felt everywhere throughout the game, with many quests interacting with it and many NPCs having something to say about politics or the state of the world. The idea of turning the Drow from D&D into an exploited Roman province was a genuinely inspired one, and the game wouldn't work remotely as well without it. Another interesting facet of Morrowind and its culture, and something we've touched on throughout this video, is that the Dunmer are still broadly evil. Most Dunmer are just trying to get by and are functioning in their day-to-day lives as mostly normal people, just normal people who worship demons and talk to their dead ancestors. At the higher levels, though, the upper classes and people in power are power-hungry, corrupt, and comically dickish for very little reason. They worship demons, hate foreigners, enslave masses of people, and can only still function through the use of legal assassins. They are a fantastically presented society that I would honestly tag as lawful evil on ye olde D&D alignment chart. The Dunmer rock, and I love them, the miserable fucks. Okay, I'm going to call this video off here. I could keep talking for hours about the Dunmer, and I will be revisiting some of the topics in this video later in more detail as this series goes on. But this script is already like twice the length of all my other ones, and this video took way too long to produce. I got debilitatingly sick during production and also had to fly across the country for a couple of weeks, so things took a hell of a lot longer than I anticipated. Next video will not be a Morrowind one. It'll be a more contained, single video retrospective of an entirely different old-ass game. I kind of don't want to end up pigeonholed as an Elder Scrolls channel until the end of time because there's already a serious shortage of new stuff to talk about, and I don't want to be grasping at even more straws than I already am. I feel really bad for Fudge Muppet. Anyway, the Morrowind series will not be ending. I'm just going to start alternating between a Morrowind or Tess video and a video about something else. I'm going slightly feral listening to so much Morrowind music while producing this series, I'm not gonna lie. I might put a Patreon vote out about which game I should cover. I'm thinking something spooky if I can get it out before Halloween. Anyway, if you've stuck around until the end of the video here, I would really appreciate it if you would subscribe and share it around, mostly because seeing that number get bigger gives me a bigger dopamine hit than hard liquor does. Anyway, I'll see you all in the next one. Peace.